Well, one of the problems we face, of course, is that with the militarization of the fight against ISIS as well as the others, we're seeing, for example, U.S. weapons are ending up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, specifically in Syria, where the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the al-Nusra Front, has recently received a bunch of new weapons directly from U.S.-backed forces who turn them over to al-Nusra. So we have to look at it in the context of what is the long-term impact of relying solely on military force. What we do hear about Afghanistan, as well as about the Iraq-Syria ISIS venue, is this notion there is no military solution. That's absolutely true. We hear it over and over from President Obama and others. The problem is the actions belie those words. If we look at the actions and not the words, what we see is that it's almost all about the military actions, and to no surprise, it's failing.
The northern Afghan city of Kunduz has reportedly fallen back into Taliban control. Government forces backed by U.S. warplanes have been fighting against the Taliban there since Monday. And this as the U.S. Defense Secretary promised a full investigation into whether the U.S. military played any role in the destruction of a hospital run by aid group Doctors Without Borders, which left 22 people dead. Paul Chaderjian reports.
Police in the northern city of Kunduz have been distributing bread and rice to residents. Many have lived without food, water, or electricity for days.
Planes are bombing us from above. Tanks are shelling us from the ground. We don't know what to do.
Afghan soldiers and the Taliban have been fighting for control of the city for more than a week. Afghan troops drive past bodies left on the ground as they patrol the city, with damaged and boarded up storefronts dotting their way. The capture of Kunduz by the Taliban was its biggest success since the armed group was removed from power in 2001. Those who were able to escape are concerned about neighbors and relatives left behind.
There is no doctor, no medicine, and no treatment in Kunduz. People are getting killed in the city, but there's nobody to help and take away their dead bodies.
A hospital operated by the aid organization Doctors Without Borders was hit by an apparent U.S. airstrike on Saturday.
We still have no explanation why this attack happened. A very precise attack on our hospital that was very well known, very well marked, and clearly without any Taliban fighter presence in that hospital.
Doctors Without Borders has denied an Afghan Interior Ministry statement that Taliban fighters were firing from inside its hospital. Several of the aid agency's staff and patients were killed. Some of the patients are said to have been burned to death in their beds. Many more were injured. The Pentagon has opened an investigation. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Zaid Raed al-Hussein says an airstrike on a hospital may amount to a war crime. The hospital had at least 200 patients. Doctors Without Borders has now pulled out of Kunduz, and their patients have been taken to Kunduz province's main hospital, which has run out of medical supplies. Its one doctor and 3 nurses are now trying to help 500 patients. The government has promised to send them a team of doctors and supplies from Kabul. Paul Chaderjian, Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera's Kais Azimi is in Puli Humri in Kunduz province, and he sent us this update.
We just got confirmation again from Afghan security sources and Afghan residents of Kunduz that they are telling us the area that Afghan government cleared this morning, most of Kunduz city, it's back in Taliban's hand. Now the residents are telling us still heavy fighting is going on. We keep receiving phone calls from those residents that they are stuck in their home. They are telling us there's no water, no food, no electricity. Life is miserable and they cannot survive for long like this. They are telling us that they are also tired of, they are also complaining about use of artillery from both sides, heavy bombardment. They are telling us that there are dead bodies and injured people that they are stuck in their homes and they cannot even move them to the hospital because they believe any movement in town could be a target from one side. Now we have a bit of a good news from the hospital of Kunduz city. Just in the last hours we got confirmation from 8 of the health department of Kunduz province that a group of 7 doctors with the medicine arrived in Kunduz city from Kabul. That's a good news for the people of Kunduz.
Well, let's cross live now to Washington, D.C. and speak to Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, a foreign policy think tank. Madam, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. We're just under a week away from when the Taliban first took control of Kunduz. Basically, they've been fighting over it for a week, and now seems the Taliban is back in control. But what it's definitely showing us is that even once the element of surprise was removed, Afghan forces haven't managed to just retake Kunduz. At this point, what action do you think the U.S. either could or should take?
You know, I think this entire crisis, this unspeakable attack on the hospital, on the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, is very much grounded in the long-standing failure of U.S. policy of trying to use military force supposedly against terrorism. It hasn't worked in Afghanistan, it hasn't worked in Iraq, it hasn't worked in any of the countries where it's been applied, and this is one more example of failure. When the U.S. tries to use massive bombardment against a heavily populated city, Kunduz is not a tiny village, it's a city of more than 300,000. Inevitably, there are going to be massive civilian casualties. In this case, despite the fact that Médecins Sans Frontières had provided the exact GPS coordinates to the United States, to the Afghan military, it was attacked twice with a few minutes in between the two parts of the attack. So the inevitability of this kind of casualty and the consequences for the community there is dramatic. And it just shows the long-standing failure of this effort to rely on military force in a way that it's simply not going to work in any of these venues.
Now, the U.S. has officially said, they have an investigation underway that will then reveal the results of that. We have, of course, seen similar cases, not on this horrific scale, but of what is often called collateral damage. Well, then if air attacks can be so damaging and not really reaching just their targets, then what do you think should happen? Do you think that there is the prospect of the U.S. sending ground troops, or do you think that at this point, because the U.S. is so involved in the Middle East, as we have seen, that ultimately Afghanistan should be sort of left to its own devices? What do you think?
You know, Barbara, I think that we have to be very careful not to look at it from the vantage point of we either go to war and send ground troops and send bombers, or we do nothing. That's never the only two options. It wasn't at the time of the 9/11 attacks, and it's not the options now. We need to provide massive rehabilitation, reparations to Afghanistan. We owe the people of Afghanistan such a huge debt for the devastation that U.S. wars have left their country in. But we also have to be clear that we don't owe continued military occupation. That means no ground troops, no escalation in airstrikes, because it's civilians that are paying the price. We say we are going after the Taliban. The worst possible thing could be the Taliban coming back. But we should remember that in 1996, at the end of 5 years of civil war inside of Afghanistan, after the long-standing war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union waged as a proxy war in Afghanistan, the Taliban were actually welcomed by large majorities of the population, not because of, but despite their horrific extremist approaches to law, to the treatment of women, etc., not because people welcomed that, but because despite that it was seen as a way of ending the war. They promised to end the civil war, and they did so for a while. In that context, the others that are supported by the U.S., the other side, not the Taliban, are almost as bad in many ways. You know, the treatment of women is not limited to the extremists of the Taliban. Outside of the very center of Kabul, the treatment of women is not all that different. We still see Afghanistan is either the worst or the second worst country in the world for women to give birth and survive, for a child to be born and have the chance of surviving to age 5. The conditions of life in Afghanistan remain horrifying, and it's true whether the Taliban is in control or whether the warlords masquerading as a US-backed government are in control. So we have to figure out ways of providing the people of Afghanistan with, whether it's medical care, whether it's money to repair the electricity, to guarantee clean water, to guarantee health care, without having to focus on the creation of a military-backed government that simply cannot provide security for the people of its own country.
I mean, obviously, all the things that you're mentioning would take a lot of money and a lot of effort on behalf of the Americans.
Absolutely.
When the U.S. and NATO went to war in Afghanistan, 14 years ago now, it was all about al-Qaeda after 9/11 and the Taliban. Now, of course, we see so many other groups that the U.S. sees as threats. ISIL, which has some groups aligned to it in Afghanistan. We're seeing other groups in Tajikistan as well, which, of course, is on the border with Afghanistan on the side of Kunduz, where all this is going on. I'm just wondering, from what you're hearing of the national and political discourse in the States, whether you think that actually anyone is really focusing on Afghanistan. I mean, do you think that there is anyone, I don't know, at the State Department or at any level of politics that is thinking along those lines, as in the fight against ISIL isn't just ISIL in the Middle East, that actually they have to see through what they started in Afghanistan?
Well, one of the problems we face, of course, is that with the militarization of the fight against ISIS as well as the others, we're seeing, for example, U.S. weapons are ending up in the hands of al-Qaeda, specifically in Syria, where the al-Qaeda affiliate, the al-Nusra Front, has recently received a bunch of new weapons directly from U.S.-backed forces who turn them over to al-Nusra. So we have to look at it in the context of what is the long-term impact of relying solely on military force. What we do hear about Afghanistan, as well as about the Iraq-Syria ISIS venue, is this notion there is no military solution. That's absolutely true. We hear it over and over from President Obama and others. The problem is the actions belie those words. If we look at the actions and not the words, what we see is that it's almost all about the military actions, and to no surprise, it's failing. So we need to have an entirely different approach where the responsibility of the U.S. is not to simply say we go to war or we abandon them. It's to say,
Phyllis,
what can we do to use those...
Forgive me for interrupting, but are you seeing any signs of that new approach actually taking hold in the U.S. in the way of thinking?
It's very, very difficult. I talk about it, other people talk about it. We don't hear it coming from members of Congress. We don't hear it from the White House and the State Department. I think that the horrific character, the unspeakable character of this latest assault in Afghanistan, where we've seen the killing of doctors, of surgeons, of nurses, as well as the patients who were burned alive in their beds in the intensive care unit, that may spark, I can only hope, this kind of discourse to be able to say, we have to stop this militarization and find a different way. There is never the choice of only war or nothing. We have to look at those other alternatives.
Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies. Madam, always good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.